Morning, Bellas Falls, and welcome to the feed. Here we are. It's July 18th.
It is July 18th. We are cruising through July.
Really fast. This is terrible. We're here with Justin Garner. Today we're going to talk about the Ketogenic Diet Part 2. But first, before then...
But first, did one of us remember where we left off?
Yeah, we'll get to that. We'll get to that in a minute. We'll have to go back and review the tapes on part one.
The tapes on part one.
We have a clip for us this morning. We created a new show here at Fact TV called CHI, Cellar Hole Investigators. In the tradition of CSI, Crime Scene Investigators, we have Bob Haas and Chris Bergman out doing forensic archaeology in Westminster West.
Very interesting.
Yes, I think
really
it is. It's a pretty interesting show.
It's really cool.
It's going to start airing here on Fact TV at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Monday through Friday, and Saturday, and 7 o'clock on Sunday. I might have that reversed. It might be 7 o'clock on Saturday and 5. But check the schedule. It'll be on demand on the web too, and I think it's going to be on the YouTube channel. So here we go with a clip of CHI.
Bob, I know that there's an interesting story.
Annual Doubleday, the Revolutionary War soldier.
CHI, wow, okay.
Yeah.
You're right up there.
Reality TV.
And the detectorists. Yes, we're forensic men now, but we all, it's just the 1880s or whatever.
And there's still water in that.
I'm Bob Haas. This is my friend, good friend, Chris Bergman. And we are the Westminster Cellar Hole Investigators.
And there they are.
And that's the beauty of public access. It really is.
They are a trip. I highly recommend the show because not just because I filmed it, but they are funny and they're entertaining
funny.
and they have a wealth of information, just unbelievable information about and there's actually a mystery vault.
There is a mystery vault. Yeah, I watched the
So
show
there is a
yesterday.
mystery.
Yeah, so there's a mystery. So it's intriguing.
Yes,
And the
there's
follow through to see what's in that vault.
yeah,
Yeah,
and I won't even
cool.
go into the whole
Oh.
other parts.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, no, I won't spoil anything. But watch the show; it's a lot of fun. And I know you are now because we were just talking that the other thing that Chris is really into is sort of natural foods and natural eating. And I think maybe at some point we should do a show about the combining of modern natural medicine and natural foods with Native American. I think that would be an
definitely.
interesting show.
Well, like what you're mentioning about like the original paleo diet,
Yeah.
because paleo is kind of like this catchword for, a type of eating that may or may not really replicate actual.
Actual paleo, like modern paleo versus real paleo. I think. I don't know if it's quite the same because we're not really out there hunting and gathering our own food quite the same way.
Well,
and it's a lot of it is based on studying modern hunter-gatherers as opposed to like what our ancestors 100,000 years ago were eating, and so there's a difference there too, between modern hunter-gatherer, or there are not that many left, but
well, you're a modern hunter-gatherer.
well,
Yeah, when you describe yourself as that?
I mean, to a degree, but not. I mean, as far as like a hunting-gathering culture where
Oh,
they're
yeah, where
subsisting
they're
on
100% hunter-gatherer. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a few like the Yanomami left, but there's not that many, and and the studies of them, and figuring out the actual percentages of foodstuffs and whatnot, there's a lot of room for error in that. So.
But doesn't that sort of segue right into what we were thinking about? What we were going to talk about today was the ketogenic diet.
Right.
Yeah.
Say words
Isn't
if
the
we're not.
ketogenic diet sort of a way of modernizing that hunter-gatherer diet?
Yeah. I mean, it's essentially trying to mimic the kind of macronutrient ratios that hunter-gatherers would have experienced most of the time, particularly like during the cold weather months when there would be less access to plant foods. And so it's kind of tweaking modern foods to mimic the hormonal aspects of a hunter-gatherer type of diet.
So just to clarify for the audience, because
Yes.
some people might not know, can you just
read.
can you just describe macronutrients, define macronutrients, so that you know what we're talking about?
Yeah, so macronutrients are the big three categories of food: protein, carbohydrate, and fat. And basically, the way the ketogenic diet breaks that down would be to usually it's defined as less than 20 grams of carbohydrates per day, and then protein, adequate protein, which that's a
That's a
That's a weighted
loaded
term,
there,
yes.
Yeah.
and actually many practitioners, the way they do the ketogenic diet is just like the minimal necessary protein, like
Minimal
typically
effective dosage, kind of.
yeah, like maybe like 0.8 grams per pound of lean mass.
Do they look at activity level?
Yeah, I mean,
protein,
activity
like
level plays a huge role,
Yeah.
but I mean, there's one whole school of thought that too much protein activates this mTOR pathway that increases aging. So some ketogenic diets, it's very minimal carbohydrate, and then the bulk of the calories from fat with just enough protein to replace lean tissue and prevent muscle wasting. Others aren't as worried about that aspect of it, and that can be a difficult thing to limit protein and fat if you're getting a lot of your fat from animal sources, because your animal fat is going to come with protein. I mean, it's not. I mean, interestingly though, like a fatty steak, even though when you look at it, most of it looks like it's lean tissue. It is. I mean, it is mostly lean, but the lean also has a lot of water weight in it. So whereas the fat is almost completely solid fat.
Dense.
So something like a ribeye is about 70% of the calories end up coming from fat. So even though
That's an interesting.
yeah, so even though commonly
It looks like a lot
these
of
diets like the Atkins diet and even the ketogenic diet are thought of as like high protein diets because you can eat quite a bit of meat on them. They're often really not particularly high because our bodies have a kind of a limit of how much protein we can deal with. So you can't really stuff your face with too much protein.
Doesn't it stress your kidneys too, like too much protein?
Well, maybe not. I mean, it doesn't. There's a lot of concerns about over protein, overconsumption of protein. Kidney things usually don't end up becoming an issue, but it's just there's just kind of a hard limit. Like you'll just get what's known as rabbit starvation, which is from a hunter-gatherer type of thing, which is too much protein with not enough fat. And so even though you're filling your body,
You're not fueling your body.
you're not fueling it correctly. I think basically with protein, our bodies would much prefer to use it to build ourselves, since a lot of our body is protein, and breaking it down to use it to just burn it for energy is not as efficient, and that's where you're going to lead to like higher uric acid levels and other problems. So that's also where if you restrict fats, you end up having a high carbohydrate diet, which is like the standard American diet. And if you restrict carbohydrates, you end up having a higher fat diet because protein has to fall somewhere within
In the middle.
a fairly normal range. So the bulk of your calories are either going to come from one side or the other.
Oh, interesting. Now, when you start talking grams and all these other things, I have no idea what you're talking about. I was like, what? Anyway, graphically, if I had 3 water bottles, and one
Complexity
is
of visual.
protein, and one is fat, and one is carbohydrate,
Yes.
Unfortunately, they're not the same size. But this might actually be good, right? Because in a typical diet, American diet, we have a big bottle of carbohydrates, and then protein is somewhere in there, but then we have a smaller bottle of fat. Because this one's only partially full.
Yeah, and I mean, so the standard American diet is based on
So is that like a typical ratio, or is it
beautiful
like
food pyramid.
is it like really like this? Maybe it's like this.
It's
Maybe it's
definitely
like this.
like this on the
Carbohydrates are like
Yeah.
this, and fats are like that. Or
Yeah, well, and I mean, this has been skewed because of the low fat advice starting in the 70s, because we push fat down, and so since protein has to stay the same size, then carbohydrate has to
Hydrates
go
go
up.
But what you're trying to do with the ketogenic diet is say
Is
this
reverse
is fat, and you have more fat, and then you have less carbohydrate, but protein again is just a sort of a constant.
right, and then
in
you
the
get
middle.
your, which
But protein
gets your
itself
body
is probably
burning
low.
this.
Yeah.
Because the high carbohydrate, the body burns what it can, but then what it can't burn, it has to
Put into fat.
store into fat. And often what ends up happening is if you're metabolically healthy, you're going to be able to utilize that fat. But over time of the high carbohydrate metabolism, in some people, some people, it never breaks down. But in others, what ends up happening is the fat is stored, but the body forgets essentially how to take the fat back out of the cells. So every time you get hungry, when you have lots of fat stores, the body, it's not really recognizing that it's got all this extra energy because it's locked away due to the hormonal response. So when someone, even if they're very obese, it doesn't mean that they're not hungry. They still are getting that hunger because the rest of their cells, other than the fat tissue, are still starving for nutrition. So that's where the blood sugar drops, and it's like, oh, it's time to eat again. And it doesn't matter that there's, a year's worth of food stored in fat.
Your body, yeah.
It's because it's essentially not accessible.
Readily accessible.
Because your body kind of takes the path of least resistance, it's going to use the immediate food coming in versus going into the locked vault. Is that kind of?
Kind of, and I mean, it has a lot to do with what hormones are being expressed, and why two different individuals can eat the same way, and one can gain a lot of weight and the other can stay thin. We've also been taught about this calories in, calories out model, and it certainly has some validity. But one of the interesting things is that the person that on a high carbohydrate diet gains weight versus the person that stays the same weight, the person who stays the same weight, when they eat those extra carbohydrates, their actual metabolism increases, their basal metabolic rate increases to burn off that extra energy. And the person who gains weight, it doesn't increase, and so then they have
just
that
goes into storage.
energy to store. So
And that comes down to how your hormones, your particular body's regulatory hormones work.
yeah, and if you think about it,
Is that genetically based, or
That's a good question.
I think a lot of it is genetically based, and in the Paleolithic past, when we were relying, much of the year on animal foods, the person who stores fat, who becomes obese today, would have had a metabolic advantage because
They would've survived.
it would have been
see?
great.
in the fall, in the summer and fall, when the berries and the tubers and the nuts are out, they're going to be eating all those carbohydrates
And they're
and
going to
store that fat. That then that food source goes away, and they go back into the ketogenic metabolism, and then they're going to be able to burn that fat all winter. Whereas the person who eats all that stuff in the summer and fall and doesn't gain anything, they're going to have a harder time making it through the
they're not
winter.
gonna make it through the
So,
winter.
so it's kind of been reversed in our modern society, where we have food accessible all the time and carbohydrates accessible all the time. The people that stay thin today, or that's genetically
thing,
is a beneficial thing. That actually was detrimental in the past. So we're
no
like,
wonder they all survived.
so we're basically selecting for a different type of genetics with the modern diet. But I mean, on the other hand, just even someone who's staying the normal weight doesn't mean that they're not getting metabolic damage. I mean, there's I've met plenty of people who are type 2 diabetics who are still, who are completely normal weight. So, sometimes it's obvious in that there's obesity happening, that there's a problem, and other times it's more insidious in that they look trim and fit, but meanwhile the hormonal process is breaking down, and like something like type 2 diabetes, where there's very high insulin levels. Insulin drives not only inflammation but also cell division, so it puts people at higher risk for cancers and just inflammatory diseases in general, arthritis and whatnot.
Interesting. So what would be your advice to someone, like maybe they're not quite ready to go ketogenic, but what would be your advice on maybe going sort of keto? Because it's a tough transition. Don't you think it's a tough transition to go 100 to just jump into keto?
Well, I mean, the switch is definitely difficult because there's what's known as the keto flu or Atkins flu, where as the body is trying to figure out how to use fat for fuel and it doesn't have carbohydrate for fuel, there can be a period of days or even a couple of weeks of loginess, and also there's a lot of water is lost because the carbohydrates that are stored as glycogen in the muscles and the liver, it also 3 molecules of water need to be stored for every glycogen. So when that glycogen is depleted, that's the water weight that's lost in the first couple of weeks, that first 8 or 10 pounds of weight that can be lost going into the ketogenic diet. And so also the electrolytes go along with it. So it's really important to watch sodium and potassium and magnesium levels during that time. But yeah, if someone's coming from a very high carb diet, like the standard American 300 carbohydrate grams a day, it's probably better to kind of go to more like of a paleo style 50 gram to 100 gram of carbohydrate for a while to start to acclimate the body. I mean, there's always going to at some point going to be a jumping off point of having to go into, because ketosis is kind of an all or not, like you're either in it or you're not. So, but it's definitely easier to step down. And also one of the hard things about the transition is that our gut bacteria, when we've been eating a high carb diet, we have a lot of bacteria that like digesting carbs, both fiber and other starches. And they actually, as they're dying off when they don't have as much food, it's very interesting. Like you can wonder who's actually running the show, because they can create all kinds of cravings for those carby things. Yeah. So a lot of it's behavioral, of like the cravings can be the worst in that first week or two, as these bugs are like, save me, give me more food.
Yeah.
I just had a mental image of yes, exactly.
Well, it's really, the research on the gut bacteria is so interesting. I was just looking at it was a mouse study, which we don't know how applicable that is, but they were using a mouse model of epilepsy to try to figure out why ketogenic diets are so beneficial for epilepsy. And they found that in mice that have been raised with no bacteria in their guts, like these quote unquote germ-free mice, that the ketogenic diet didn't have any anti-epileptic effect. And then the same thing was true in mice that they hit with heavy antibiotics. So they looked around, and there were a couple species of bacteria that they found were upregulated with a ketogenic diet that produced the anti-epileptic effect. And then when they transplanted those bacteria into mice that were just on regular mouse chow, it had the same anti-epileptic effect. So that's just kind of an interesting. So like the bacteria were actually involved in determining whether there was the epileptic episodes or not.
So there's a lot more with your gut than your gut and diet than kind of meets the eye.
Well, potentially, yeah. And so like that's the other thing with like probiotics is like I think a lot of probiotics are kind of formulated on a high carb diet. The bacteria that are often in probiotic supplements are ones that are more for high carbohydrate diets.
Oh, interesting.
And and there's huge changes when switching because all those guys can't eat it.
What about if you're getting your probiotics like with fermented things like kimchi or
kefir. That's a different story, I think.
Okay.
But typically,
or
like
even kombucha, same thing, or
I think those are more diverse and are
Okay.
more likely to provide a full spectrum. And not that it's necessarily bad. It's just interesting because we really are only the tip of the iceberg about figuring out all these different. I mean, there's so
The
many different,
microbiome is
the whole
really-
microbiome, and when it's like 10 cells of bacteria for every one of our cells with our
Well,
own
yeah,
DNA, it's like,
someone said something like there are more different kinds of bacteria in your body than there are people on the earth.
yeah. I mean,
It's
that's
like-
pretty hard to think about.
When you think about that, it's like, wow, that is just, and they do affect pretty much everything, I guess, like digestion, mood.
It seems like it, you know. So there's that whole interaction there, but definitely, I think one of the biggest barriers for people going into the ketogenic diet is the potentially the lack of productivity during that 1 or 2 weeks as you're switching over, and the urges to
cravings.
Yeah.
the cravings for these foods, which may or may not be coming from yourself or from these organisms.
So,
in you.
so the cravings can be real. I mean, they can be
Oh, they're
physiological versus psychological, which I think a lot of people think they're just psychological.
Right.
Like you're craving because it's a habit, but it's a physiological.
That's
body
the interesting
response.
thing,
Yeah,
is
that
that
is
there's like,
intriguing.
and if you think about like half the population worth of people on the planet dying off in your gut, they're like their collective little screams adds up to
collective little scream.
give me a bagel, you know?
That's exactly
Like,
right. That's
so,
exactly right. Well, I watched this program that was on Netflix called The Magic Pill.
Magic pill, yep.
And they were talking about the ketogenic diet. And they were talking about the guy was saying it really is difficult for people to switch, and to switch, even people who had been in sort of hunter-gatherer sort of tribes, to switch back was really incredibly difficult. And his suggestion was to make it a process, to start with just staying away from things that might have a shelf life of 2 years. That
Right.
those things probably
Yeah,
aren't good
not
for
good
you.
for you,
That
exactly.
you should
Well,
probably go to get something like fresh things and move out of the center of the grocery store into the edges.
right. Get
And
your
then-
carbohydrate from sweet potato, not from Wonder Bread.
Yeah,
Or candy, or those orange balls that were in here a
Yes.
few months ago.
Oh, yes. Right.
Whatever you do, don't follow the fact
I was going
TV
to say,
diet.
Fact TV had junk food around? That is so shocking.
There's anything
Because
that's
their little
here can
bacteria are
last
really
for
like,
Japanese. Anyway,
But I
we
think that's-
digress.
We digress, but I think we brought up some good points as far as, I think if people aren't ready to go to a specific diet, which I don't always know if I'm 100% on board with, I think you have to
Yeah,
figure
well,
out what
that's
works for you. Like you're saying that one person metabolizes this way, one person metabolizes the other way. But if we can really start to go towards clean, natural food, that's a huge step.
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's what he was saying. The
Stuff
person-
that looks like food,
Yeah, if
like-
it was grown, then it probably might be good for you. If
Yeah, it
it's
doesn't have
something-
nutrition label like
Yeah.
there is a huge. I mean, that right there will make a huge benefit.
Yeah, if somebody's not quite, if they just want to take like a step.
And also not drinking calories. That's a huge one too. Any like all those
Sodas,
sweetened beverages and stuff. That,
Juice.
removing those. Those are things that it's can. I mean, part of the whole thing too is that carbohydrates are extremely addictive. So there's some people really treat it like it's an addiction, like a day at a time kind of thing, because there is such a strong compulsive
craving,
component, and
Trust me.
and
We're
like
all there.
people can be even have been on the ketogenic diet and then end up craving something, have it, and then like wake up a month later like what happened?
Carbohydrate coma. Yeah.
I mean,
Been
but-
there, done that.
In a hotel room in Las Vegas at the end of
With
the
donuts all over the place. Krispy Kremes. In the middle of a Krispy Kreme store.
Yeah, so I mean, even though we joke as far
Yeah, I
as
know.
compared
It's
to like
hard.
alcohol or drugs, as far as the
No, it's right.
the negative benefits immediately. It's a similar kind of
Well, it
be
makes-
a similar kind of
and
compulsion.
I have to say it makes sense to me now because when I did the Whole30 and cut out, basically everything, I literally took it one meal at a time. Like literally said, okay, I'm just gonna I got through that meal. Whew, not going to worry about the next one. Got through the next one and literally did that for 30 days. But that carbohydrate craving was crazy. And I was, in my head, I'm like, no, I just have to be mentally stronger. And didn't really connect it to a true physiological craving, a physiological
those
gut
bacteria,
craving.
yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's not
Yeah.
just. I mean, yeah, because it's easy to just be like, oh, you're not.
I'm
You're not the
enough.
moral
Yes,
fiber for
yes,
it,
exactly.
you know?
I'm not strong
you-
enough, and then you beat yourself up.
Right.
I mean, I'm not saying but if you kind of understand that, and then you're like, okay, I just have to get through this. I just have to get past it. It's not that I'm weak. My body's giving me a physiological response, and I just have to get past it. So that
Yeah.
kind of changes, for me anyway, it changes my perspective on it. But unfortunately,
And the
once
clock
again,
on the wall says, we like
says-
this clock on the wall now because it's much more persistent
Keeps
than
us on.
my little timer. Justin, thanks again for coming in. It's
Yeah.
always
Excellent.
great to
Thanks
have
for
you
having
here. Great show. Coming up next week,
No feed.
no feed. Marty and I are going on a road trip. We're going to speak at the Wilmington Rotary on opioid addiction and what the Rotary can do to help their communities. And so you're going to have to watch
You're gonna
Justin
have to
for 2
wait
weeks in a
for 2
row.
weeks in a row.
Yay!
Bye,
Which is a
community.
good thing. Bye, community. And
That's it, folks, for the feed. Be sure to catch us every Wednesdays at 7:30 a.m. Also, find us on Facebook at Fact TV or tell us what you think. thefeed8@gmail.com. And don't forget to watch the feed online at www.fact8.com.